Hey there, art nerds. So I have a really cute start to finish tutorial for you guys today. Today we are going to be sketching, inking, and painting a very cute miniature mushroom house. We're also going to be drawing and painting a frog and a lizard, as well as a honeybee and some dandelions. So if you are as excited about this early fall illustration as I am, grab your pencils, grab your inking pens, and grab your paints, and let's get started. Now, before we get started, if you would prefer to just paint or color along with me, the line art is available over on my Patreon at patreon.com/natosoup. In fact, all of my start to finish tutorial line arts are over on Patreon in the line arts and printables section, I believe. I'll bring it up here so you guys can see what I'm talking about. So now would be a great time to join and gain access to this big library of line arts and coloring sheets. Otherwise, you are free and welcome to sketch and ink and paint along with me today. The materials I'm going to be using are my favorite watercolors. So this is my Daily Driver watercolor palette. You can use any watercolor palette you wish. You may just have to do some color mixing. A variety of watercolor brushes, including quills and rounds, squirrel, and synthetic, but you're definitely going to want a couple of smaller synthetic brushes on hand because we are going to be using masking fluid. You're going to want some ceramic mixing surfaces. You can use sauce dishes, you can use salad plates, you can use ceramic palettes. Whatever you have on hand will probably work. I'm painting today in a Canson XL watercolor sketchbook, so this is a cellulose-based sketchbook, and I'm using a Sakura Pigma FB to ink. As previously mentioned, I have a Canson XL watercolor sketchbook. I also have a thumbnail sketch on a post-it note of the idea I have in mind. I utilize thumbnailing or doing smaller, sketchier, less refined drawings to help me figure out what kind of illustrations I want to share with you guys on a regular basis, and this really helps me defeat white page syndrome. I am using a Pentel red lead and a Muji mechanical pencil to kind of block in all of my forms. I started out by doing a composition grid just to kind of help me place things on the paper. And if you're looking for tutorials on how to do composition grids, check the description below. I will link additional tutorials. Once I have everything very, very lightly and loosely sketched in, and typically what I will do is rather than sitting while I'm sketching, I will stand over it so that I can get a better view of the whole without it getting skewed. If you can adjust your drafting table so that it is up at an angle, that will also help fix the skewing. But after I've got everything kind of sketched in and placed, I start refining the details, pressing a little more heavily on my lead and just kind of adding things in. So I call this working big to small. We're starting with big, blocky, rounded shapes, and we're working progressively smaller, breaking things up and adding more details. This is kind of a spin on my volumetric drawing. So if you're looking for more drawing tutorials, I have a whole series on volumetric drawing that should get you started if you're drawing along with me today. So I started with our frog and our lizard, and I also want to point out that I am working heavily with reference. I'm not drawing any one particular photo, but I am drawing heavily utilizing reference. Also, if I need to erase something and fix it, generally I will pause the camera to erase it because otherwise it really shakes my camera because my camera is attached to my drawing table. So if it looks like a little bit of Photoshop magic, it's just me trying to spare you guys some motion sickness. So I have sketched in our frog, I have sketched in our lizard, I have sketched in our front door, and now I'm kind of working and adding in some of these surrounding flora. So like our clovers and our dandelion and our additional mushrooms, which are not flora. I think they're in a class all their own. I did reference these mushrooms. I don't remember what mushroom I selected as our color reference and our basic design reference. I apologize for that, but I really am pointing out referencing a lot because I think a lot of artists don't talk about how much they're referencing things, and I think just for the sake of transparency, honesty, and confidence building, it's important that you guys know that I am looking all of these things up. I do not have a photographic memory. Actually, I have a really terrible memory, so I have to look things up all the time. That is very normal. While I was at SCAD pursuing my master's degree in sequential art, we were constantly reminded to look things up. And if something looked kind of wonky and it wasn't because of like the art style, we were asked if we had referenced it. So there is absolutely nothing wrong with referencing. In fact, I highly encourage it. So I have also referenced our little bee here, and I apologize that my hand is blocking what I am drawing. But as you guys can see, I'm starting with like really, really basic shapes like circles, and then breaking those down and adding in more details. And I find that this just kind of helps me draw overall. I don't know that at this point I could just go in with a bold, confident line without doing some preliminary drawing first. And while some people might have opinions on that, I will have to say that doing this kind of preliminary drawing has made drawing and art more accessible for me. And I encourage you to do what you need to do to make art accessible for you, to make it part of your daily life and to make it something that you feel confident in doing. And if that means doing some underdrawing, if that means using reference, then by all means, please do. So now that I have everything kind of sketched in, I am inking. I'm using a waterproof brush pen. This is a Sakura Pigma FB. I really, really like these. One of the beautiful selling points of brush pens is you can basically ink this entire thing with one pen. You do not need 8 different microns to get 8 different line widths. With a little bit of control and a little bit of practice, you can ink this entire thing. Now, one piece of advice is this has been time-lapsed 8x. Because ain't nobody got time to watch this in its, real time glory of like 2 to 3 days. So give yourself breaks when you're inking. Take your time, rotate the paper as much as you need so that you can get the angles that are comfortable for your wrist. Recording, like doing art on TikTok and YouTube, is kind of deceptive because we don't move or rotate our paper as much as you might think we do, and it ends up causing a lot of wrist pain and wrist strain. So if you're drawing along at home, please rotate the paper, move it to an angle that's more comfortable, do what works for your hand and for your body. Don't try to fight it. On that note, I have a comfort grip on my Sakura FB. I always put comfort grips on my pens now because that helps with repetitive strain, and I'm heavy-handed. I tend to over grip my pens and my pencils, and having this kind of a comfort grip is protecting my hand and increasing the longevity of my drawing career. And if you guys are interested in drawing more comfortably, I have a video where I talk about a variety of comfort grips and drawing aids. I will link that for you guys down in the description below. But I'm a big proponent of doing what you need to do to protect your drawing hands. I have early onset arthritis. I also have Sjogren's syndrome. So, anything I can do to make drawing more comfortable and easier and more sustainable so I can continue to draw for you guys in the foreseeable future, that is something that I am going to do. And it's also something I'm going to advocate, because if I can save you guys some pain, I am all about that. But basically, I'm just working my way front to back, so overlapping objects on top of background objects, foreground to background, basically. I am working my way back, object to object, and just kind of inking things one thing at a time. I have a sheet of just scratch copy paper right here, and that's something that I can rest my hand on. It prevents me from smearing it's not graphite, it's red lead. It does still smear, but it also prevents me from transferring the oils from my hand onto the paper, which can cause a resist problem when we're watercoloring it. So just a cheap sheet of copy paper will get the job done. So one of my tips for inking something like this, where there's actually a lot of little elements, and I'm trying to ink this in one go if possible. Of course, you do not have to if that does not work for you. Is that I put on music that I can kind of chill out to, or I put on a comfort show, something I've seen a bunch of times that's not super distracting, and it just kind of lets me enter a flow state and I can just focus on inking. So that's one of the recommendations that I have for you guys. However, if you do need to break it up over several days, there's nothing wrong with that. We all have busy lives. We all have other obligations. While being a full-time artist is wonderful, even full-time artists have other work that they have to do and other obligations, and they have family to take care of and pets to take care of. So don't beat yourself up if you need to break this up into several days. There is nothing wrong with that. And the start to finish tutorial series, the way this kind of functions is I show you guys how I draw it, I show you guys how I ink it, I show you guys how I paint it, and it's on fairly accessible materials. This is a Canson XL watercolor sketchbook. Walmart used to sell these. They don't anymore. They've switched to be paper, but Michaels sells these. You can get these almost anywhere that sells basic craft and art supplies. Sakura Pigma FB, same thing. You can also use a Zebra Furunosuke Those are also, I think it's zebra. I'll have to double check myself. But anyway, you can also use a Futonosuke. Those are, no, I'm sorry. It's a Tombow Futonosuke. There we go. Those are also waterproof. I've tested those. I paint with those. I use alcohol marker with those. You can find those at Walmart. So I'm trying to select art supplies that are accessible. The mechanical pencil, it happens to be a Muji mechanical pencil. Those are inexpensive plastic mechanical pencils. Any pencil that you like to use will work for this. And it's Pentel Red Lead. You can find that just about anywhere. The only thing that is a little bit more of a specialty are the watercolors. Again, this is my daily driver palette. So it's the watercolor palette I use for my comic pages and I use for my personal illustrations, but you can use whatever watercolors you enjoy and you like. And I have entire playlists where I review student grade, so less expensive watercolors as well as more expensive watercolors, all with the goal of helping more people pick up traditional art and helping more people fall in love with making art and drawing for pleasure and enjoyment. Now, on that note, if you happen to like how this finished illustration turned out and you would like to own it for yourself, unfortunately, this is in a watercolor sketchbook, so I cannot in good conscience sell it to you. However, I will have prints of this available up in my shop at nattosoup.com/shop. I have a lot of my start to finish tutorials available as prints because some of them just turned out so dang cute. So if you like my art and you'd like to own a little bit of it and you'd like to support what I do, you can head over there, and it really does mean the world to me. I always include a thank you note and some little extra goodies because when you support a small business, you're doing more than just buying a thing. You're supporting somebody's dreams, and it just really means so much to me. So you guys can see I did all of the little flora and fauna surrounding our mushroom first, and then I inked our mushroom, and I'm just kind of taking my time with it, working piece by piece. I'm not necessarily like inking an eye and then skipping around and inking something else totally across the page. I find that when I do that, it makes it look less cohesive. I ink an entire thing if I can, and then I go back to it. So now I am mixing up it's not really a light blue. It is a light blue because there is a lot of water added to the mix, and I am using a small little sauce dish that I got at the Asian food market. So I use this as like a wash container. So a little bit of paint, a whole lot of water. You can use whatever colors speak to your heart. These are just what I am using. I'm not going to give you guys specific color names and specific brands because I actually don't know, but it doesn't really matter. Whatever works for you and whatever you like is good enough. Now, I am also underpainting in the blue on the clover. So no, it's white clover, but white often casts a shadow of gray or blue. And when I'm painting clover, I like to go with blue. It kind of reflects the blue of the sky, that sort of thing. So as I add my layers and I decide, oh, hey, I need more XYZ, I'm just going to darken that color. That first layer has dried. Now I'm going over it with a slightly darker, slightly more saturated layer. Now, one of the great things about cellulose papers, they can be a bit of a fight. I have a whole video where I talk about how to make the most out of your cellulose watercolor papers. But in addition to being inexpensive and easy to find, they actually have a dry time relative to the humidity in the room. So you may feel like you have more control over the dry time. And one of the ways you can control the dry time is you can turn on your air conditioner or your heater, get that air moving in your house. You can also turn on a fan, or you can even use a hairdryer, although that is not my preference, just to kind of speed up those dry times. You can also soak up any excess standing water that might be standing on the page, because unlike cotton rag, which soaks up that water and that pigment, that's one of the wonderful things about cotton rag, cellulose, it all is on the surface level. It's all on the top of the paper. So you can actually pick up the excess using a paper towel, and that will also help speed up the dry time, as you guys see me doing here. You can also use that just to kind of help control the appearance of pooling or unevenness. Sometimes you want pooling, sometimes you want cauliflowering, sometimes you want blooming, but that should be something you choose to introduce. Happy accidents are great, and I do love them from time to time, but when it comes to controlling dry times, I'm pretty big on picking up any water on the page that I don't need at that time. I want to prepare to paint the mushroom, so I'm going to mix up a couple of the browns that I think I'm going to use. I'm going for kind of more warm browns, more reddish browns, and I'm mixing them fairly weak with a lot of water. I'm also going to apply masking fluid to our little lizard buddy here, and my masking fluid has been decanted in a small glass jar, the kind you get at Dollar Tree. I am using a synthetic brush to apply my masking fluid, and before I started, I wet my synthetic brush and rubbed in some brush soap. You can also use just a little bit of bar soap that doesn't have any kind of lotion in it. And what this does is it prevents the masking fluid from being sucked up into the ferrule, the metal collar on the brush, and basically ruining the brush. It protects the bristles. Now, I will say that some people act like this is a fail stop or fail-proof method, I guess is the way I want to say it, for protecting your brushes when you're adding masking fluid. I always add soap to my brushes, and I have still ruined brushes. So I've read that you can use petroleum jelly to help remove the excess masking fluid that's dried in there. I'm going to try that and report back to you guys. So I have masked off my lizard. I am using one of the lighter browns as the white on the frog's neck, and I'm also using the brown on the stem and stalk part of the mushroom. And for that, I'm doing a little bit of a wet into wet with a darker brown. It's probably a burnt umber. And that's to imply, kind of like if you look at a mushroom, right? The stem often has like a little bit of bruising or a little bit of mottling of color, or maybe a little bit of dirt on it. It's not always one uniform color. So doing this little wet into wet dabbing kind of helps give that impression, kind of helps with that fantasy. For the mushroom cap, I have this reddish orange that I have mixed up. And you can see why I masked off the lizard. I want to be able to apply this very quickly without having to work around fiddly areas. And that's going to leave me room for wet into wet if I want to do wet into wet. Now that I've got that full roof filled in, I can start going in with a darker version of the color wet into wet and encouraging it to diffuse out. And I'm being kind of sloppy in my application on purpose. I want it to feel a little bit more vibrant, a little fresher, and that's why we masked off the lizard, is so that we wouldn't have to worry about that as we do our wet into wet techniques. I'm also going to do the same thing on the smaller mushroom cap that is serving as kind of like a roof over the door. Now, one of the beautiful things about watercolor is that where you start off never has to be where you end up. You can keep adding layers, you can lift things, you can work on things, you can do wet into wet, you can adjust things. And that's kind of what I was doing with this mushroom cap. It was way too light, so I'm able to go in, and I'm not even necessarily waiting for it to dry. I'm going to allow this kind of interesting mottled drying pattern that we're going to get from some of it being kind of still wet, some of it being kind of dry. I'm going to use that to my advantage. I also did not point this out because I didn't notice it. I don't know why I didn't notice it, but I did actually add some masking fluid to the dandelion puff as well as the clover to allow for this looser kind of watercolor addition. As I'm painting, I'm definitely assessing the color. Is this what I want it to be? Is this the look I'm going for? I already know what kind of colors I'm going to be using for the grass, for the frog, for the anole. So I have those in mind, even though they haven't been blocked in. So this kind of allows me to be like, okay, I want a richer, I want a warmer, I want a more brown sort of color for the top of this mushroom, so I can progressively add in more brown and more dark red for this. If you're painting along at home, you may hit it on the first go. You may need to only do a couple layers. However you find the colors and the look that you're looking for, that is fine. For me, this was a bit more of a journey, more application, more playing around with things, adding some more brown here, as you guys can see, and allowing that to diffuse out wet into wet, that sort of thing. It was more of a journey for me, but in a way, this is good because not everything is going to be straightforward. That's one of the beautiful things about art. Sometimes it takes you a while to get there, and you shouldn't beat yourself up if it took you a while to get there. That's natural and part of the process. And sometimes with time lapses and with heavily edited video, we cut a lot of that figuring things out part out because nobody really wants to sit around and watch that. I say that. I love seeing people figure that kind of stuff out. A few years ago, we went to Japan and I visited the Kyoto Manga Museum, and they had this dash reproduction exhibit, which basically is like a faithful reproduction of what those pages look like without like digital corrections, without lettering, like whatever the artist submitted. And you could see all of the mistakes, you could see all of the corrections, and I loved that. I loved seeing these other artists problem solve in real time. So that's what you guys are seeing me do. I am problem solving in real time. I have kind of an idea of what I want. I definitely have reference of what I want. I want more texture. I want more variety. I want more liveliness because we're covering a large area with this mushroom top, right? If it had all been kind of one uniform color or a really smooth ombre, or if it was too perfect, it'd be really boring to look at. So by adding in this wet into wet, adding in this texture, doing some swipes of water to move color from one area to another, we're building up the texture that I want for this mushroom cap, and it's going to become more interesting to look at. It's going to be a character in this illustration in and of itself, because we've only got like 4 things going on here. We have a bee off to the side. We have that little anole defending his territory. And then we have our little satisfied frog down at the bottom looking quite happy and quite pleased with himself. And then finally, the house itself is a character in this illustration. So I want to bring character to that. And I can do that by adding in texture and adding in shadow and adding in grit and adding in what might read as imperfections. That gives more personality. So when I added the masking fluid to the dandelion, I didn't mask off the whole area that was in front of the mushroom. I just masked off some of it, and you guys will see as I remove it. And what that does is it allows me to paint through the dandelion, so you can kind of see through the dandelion puff, while retaining some of those highlights that I can work in later. And I allowed my roof to completely and fully dry, no matter how long it took. I actually don't remember how long it took before I removed the masking fluid. And I'm using a masking fluid pickup to do that. That works best for me. It means I'm not tearing the paper. Whatever method works for you is a valid method, and you know, whatever works, right? So for the dandelion, I decided to add in a little bit more red, kind of blend things out. I'm adding in some brown underneath the mushroom cap to kind of add in some shading. So sometimes with the start to finish series, I will use complementary color shading, or I'll do a grise or a bluier underpainting, sometimes not. One of the goals is to mostly work with local color and getting that contrast, getting that shading going with just the local color, so that it's a brighter illustration and it may be a little easier for people to paint along. One of the downsides to painting on a cellulose paper is that it just can't take as many layers as a cotton rag can, and colors may start to reactivate or scrape up. So part of the point of this series is to do something that is a little simpler and a little lighter handed, that utilizes these less expensive papers. And I do have, if you're like, Becca, you are saying that, but this illustration is not reflecting that. And I'm adding a little bit of kind of a greenish yellow that I've pre-mixed, as well as kind of it's not a hot pink, it's not an opera rose. It's a more stable, less fugitive color, but it's still a really bright pre-mixed convenience color pink to his little wattle on his throat, his little territorial, don't mess with me thing. I've been building up this series for a couple of years now. There are some very, very straightforward, simple, hold your hand tutorials in the start to finish that are a little bit earlier on. And I wanted to be able to build on this to more complicated stuff and kind of bridge it into some of the other watercolor series that I've done. So if you are looking to paint mushrooms today, but you're looking for something a little bit simpler, check the cards and check the description. I have several mushroom tutorials linked for you guys. So I am kind of building up the green on our lizard friend, the green and the pink. So I have a bunch of round watercolor brushes. There are artists who will tell you you just need one, or you just need like 3 brushes total, or you know, a good artist can do whatever. Yeah, sure, maybe if that works for them, but you know, I take a page from the Chinese watercolor painting book, not the book, but like that, you know, the notion of Chinese watercolor, the tradition is the word I was looking for, and blanking on it terribly. And I will utilize 3 or 4 brushes so that I can have all the colors I need on the brush, and this will allow for wet into wet. This will allow for color blending. This will allow me to work a little bit more quickly. If you just have one brush, you can still do many of these techniques. I'm just not gonna lie to you guys and pretend like I used just one brush for this when I used like 5 brushes for this. And I'm kind of just slowly building up the color, trying to build in texture, building in wet and wet. I am definitely working from reference rather than trying to go with what I remember an anole lizard looking like, because although I spent my whole childhood chasing them and hunting them and playing with them, I have an idea of what they look like, and that helps me to caricature this little guy, but I want it to really look like an anole. So I'm bringing in some of that blue around the eye and some of the warmer greens and some of the cooler greens, and I'm noticing how there's some areas that are one color and some areas that are another, because being an artist is all about noticing things and bringing them into your work. Speaking of noticing things, I'm using a cooler green, almost like a blue green, to paint our little froggo friend here, still referencing this little guy, going in and adding in some shadows after the initial layer of green dried, using the same blue that we used from the background. So it's going to kind of marry the two together and make him feel more like he belongs here. So we actually do have a little bit of blue yay that has been worked into this piece. And if you are interested in Grisé and Bluet, you probably know what I'm going to say by now. I have a tutorial that will walk you guys through it. I have several tutorials that will walk you guys through it, because what I try to do here is I try to build on things, and I try to keep you guys coming back and always learning more, because I'm always learning more. And I hope that every new tutorial I present something new that you can learn. So I did another layer of the green. I'm working a little bit of yellow, cool yellow in, wet into wet, so that we can get those brighter pops of color on the frog's skin, and I'm going to allow that to dry. Going in and adding some shadows to our clover, and then going back and kind of reworking the frog. And again, speaking of noticing things, I'm trying to do some closer in angles, even though it moves the camera some, because like the camera is literally resting on the sketchbook. What do you guys think about this? Do you like these close-up angles? Does it bother you that it's kind of a Dutched shot? It's kind of a off to the angle shot, and it's not just straightforward on. Let me know what you guys think. I like it better. It's something I've noticed that like Kaiteki art does, like pulling in really close so you can really see what's going on, even if you can't see the mixing palette, even if you can't see the colors. Oh, right there, I reread it with a little bit of water, and I am just lifting it with a paper towel to get that highlight back into the frog's skin. And that's one of the nice things about cellulose is you can usually relift it and rework it pretty far back. Nice things, awful things. If you know how to utilize it, it's great. If you're new to it and you haven't quite found your legs for it yet, it can be very frustrating. Now that I've got the greens on the frog and the lizard blocked in, a warmer green on the lizard and a cooler green on the frog, but both provide a lot of contrast with the warm brownish red that we used on the mushrooms, I'm going to start using a cooler blue, it's probably a phthalo blue knowing me, to start blocking in the background clovers. And this is I'm going to layer it with a green, and it's going to make for a cooler, darker green. Working in a watercolor sketchbook like this, you may notice that your paper starts to buckle and curl if you don't find some way to support it. A lot of people like to use clips. I don't. I like these Chinese watercolor weights. They can be repositioned really easily, and they do a really good job of holding the paper down without leaving marks. So for a little bit of contrast, I decided to paint the door in our mushroom kind of a bright and vibrant blue. And as you guys can see from what I mentioned earlier, I'm adding in a layer of green on top of our clover. I'm also doing that for the foreground clover. So that's going to be the base color for the foreground clover. And it's kind of a layered or glazed secondary color on top of the clover that we've already painted blue. And you guys can see how much that blue really adjusts the color, really darkens it, makes it seem more in the background, makes it seem more shaded, which is exactly what we're going for here. And I think I'm just using what I would consider kind of a standard green. It's probably like a hooker's green. So it's very middle green, right? It's not overly cool and it's not overly warm. Going to use a little bit of masking fluid to add a highlight to the windows. That's just going to reserve the color so that when we paint on top of it, we still have that lighter color underneath. And you guys can see, actually, this is a cooler green. I think the second layer, I mixed more blue, like cool phthalo blue, into the green so that we get a cooler green for our shamrocks. Since I'm right next to our little frog here, I'm going to go in with some more phthalo blue or cool blue and just kind of add in some shadows to his skin using that blue. Since we did all that green painting already, it'll definitely read as shadow without desaturating it. And I'm adding a little bit of wood texture to the blue door. And then that window we just talked about, I'm using some of that sky blue to start painting in the windows and kind of start building in that shadow. I'm going to use a little bit of Quin Gold for the eyes of the frog and dab in a little bit of probably like yellow ochre and let that dry. And then go in and add some more shadow to my windows. So at this point, like remember with inking, I'm like finish inking the thing you were inking, don't skip around. With watercolor, while I'm waiting for things to dry, I will usually skip around quite a bit. So I'm still darkening those windows as you guys can see. Probably using an indigo, maybe a Payne's gray for this if you're curious. So a bluer sort of gray. So I'm using a little bit of masking fluid to mask out the open and flowering dandelion as well as the bottom of the puffball dandelion. And I'm masking it so that I can paint the dandelion leaves quickly utilizing wet into wet techniques, kind of similar to what I did with the mushroom top. I'm also using kind of like an olive green, a really warm green with a little bit of Daniel Smith's undersea green, which is a really granulating warm green that has indigo and gold in it, for the moss in front of the mushroom house's door. And I'm just using like really short, kind of stubby little brush strokes going upward to kind of give the impression of moss. So at this point, I am really focusing on building up layers of local color or near local color to kind of get the shading and the depth and the saturation that I'm looking for. And this is particularly true with the clover, but it's also true with the door. And this can be a really good chance to add in some texture. Texture really helps describe what you're looking at. Wood textures on wooden doors make it look like a wooden door. Like little short carpety looking textures on moss makes it look like moss instead of just filling something in and filling something in and filling something in, which, to be fair, is something that I have been guilty of for years. So I'm trying to push myself to capture textures more, and it's one of the reasons I'm relying on reference photos more and really thinking about the textures of the things I'm painting and how I can use my brush to kind of capture that. So with the dandelion leaves, I'm starting out with a wash of yellow. And then I'm going for a warm sort of green for the dandelion leaves so that they don't blend in so much with the clover. They kind of stand out distinct. You could choose to have them kind of blend in with the clover and just kind of be a background element. It's really up to you and what you're looking for. I have mixed up some green gold. So I like to use Winsor & Newton green gold. I think it's a really beautiful color. It really reminds me of the Louisiana swamps in the spring when everything's starting to green out again. So now I'm grabbing a more saturated version of that color. You guys see I'm using 2 multi-weld ceramic palettes for this. It's just easier for me to mix up the amount of color and then allow it to evaporate if I want to, so that I can build up the saturation over time. So one of my watercolor techniques is allowing time to do a lot of my work for me. And this also enables me to do other things if I need to do some chores or to take a break or to run some errands, rather than trying to complete a watercolor painting all in one sitting. There's nothing wrong with completing a watercolor painting all in one sitting if that's what you like to do and what works for you, but it doesn't work for a lot of artists, a lot of people who have kids or who at work or taking care of pets or whatever. So I just want to like normalize that sitting down and working on something in multiple sessions is also fine, and you are still an artist. So I've got my 3rd layer of saturation of the green gold going on, and now I'm adding in some wet into wet. You know, it wouldn't be me if I wasn't playing around with wet into wet. And I'm working segment by segment here because on cellulose paper, working at this kind of saturation, it can dry really quickly. And I want to make sure that I get good color diffusal and good color movement on this. And I was using Daniel Smith's Undersea Green for this, but again, any darker, warmer green would work. Some of that undersea green has dried, some of it has not. I'm going in with a little bit of indigo just to add in some shadow so that these leaves appear further in the background. For the dandelion, I used the same technique that I used with the mushroom cap, where I masked off some areas, removed the masking fluid, and are kind of painting more of the leaf in so that it has that kind of transparent effect. If you find that you went too far with the transparency and it's too see-through, you can work some of that back in with white gouache, and I'll show you that in a little bit. I'm also kind of correcting the areas. So one of the reasons I don't like relying on masking fluid is that I always apply it kind of blobby. There's always going to be areas that get masked that shouldn't have gotten masked. And so I'm going to have to go back and just kind of fix things a little bit. And that's what I'm doing, is just kind of taking the time to fix those leaves so that there isn't like areas that should have been painted that ended up not getting painted. I apologize for blocking your view. I am painting the dandelion flower itself with a warm yellow, kind of reminiscent of the yellow we're going to be using on the honeybee. The bee got a base coat of a warm yellow, and I'm just kind of also picking around as I'm waiting for things to dry, like noticing things that I'm not super satisfied with and going back and fixing them or adjusting them. So this is one of the like upsides of not completing a painting all in one sitting, is it gives you a chance to take breaks, refresh your eyes, and fix things that you don't necessarily love or need a little bit of additional work for you to love it. So for the bee, I already have the kind of goldish color. I am going to add brown stripes and then add black to that, and that's going to give kind of that weird goldish brown black that you see on honeybees that have a lot of pollen in them. That's kind of what I'm going for. I added another layer of our warm yellow, and now I'm adding a little bit of Van Dyke brown to the bee, kind of in stripes, so that we can start working on what I was just talking about. Probably adding in a little bit of sepia, and then maybe even adding in a little bit of black wet into wet to allow it to diffuse, so there isn't like this stark contrast between the colors. To complete the illusion of transparency with our dandelion puff, I'm going to go back in and paint the sky as well, so that it just, you know, looks more cohesive and it looks more transparent. At this point, this illustration is basically finished, almost finished. So now is a good time to take a break, give yourself some fresh eyes, and that way you can come back and you can see what little color adjustments, what tweaks, the things you might have missed. This is particularly one for my ADHD people. I also have ADHD, and that kind of detail orientation, or being detail oriented, I really need to take a break and kind of reset my brain and reset my eyes, and then I can focus on finding those mistakes and finding those details and adding in those finishing touches. So that's like a little tip that I found to be really helpful, is give yourself breaks, build in breaks, even if the hyper focus is going strong, even if the flow is going strong. So once I am almost done, I'm going to use a little bit of white gouache, and I am gross, and I just dip straight into the tube. It's my gouache. I don't have to answer to anybody. It's also kind of dried in the tube, so I can't really squeeze it out anymore, but that it works better for me like this anyway, because I used to waste a lot of gouache when I would apply it to my palette, so this works for me, okay? But I'm using a small synthetic brush just to add in some rim lighting and some highlighting and some dots and some details, and just trying to clean things up, and using the white gouache to add just a little bit of contrast here and there, or to add back in some white that might have gotten just a little bit lost in the process of this painting. Like my clover were looking a little too smooth, so I am actually splattering on some clean water, letting it sit for just a moment, and then lifting it back up with a paper towel. And this will give kind of a mottled texture, and this is actually the technique that I use when I want to draw in dewdrops after the fact. Complete the illusion of dewdrops, I'm going to grab some of the sky color and just add a little rim of that blue onto those areas that we just lifted out. You don't have to do it for every single one. It works a little bit better with some of the larger ones. Adding just a dot of white gouache at the top of those dewdrops helps complete the effect. although watercolor is considered a transparent medium, there are a lot of colors that carry some opacity to it, and that can obscure your line art. We can use this in our favor though, because this can help us create the illusion of lighting and depth. So I am just going to re-ink just the areas that need that additional contrast back, that need that additional shadow back, just to kind of rebalance the page and to help keep it from becoming muddy. Because this was an inked illustration to start with, and when we add those glazes of color on top of it and they kind of obscure the line art, we kind of make everything almost the same like intensity of color, and we obliterate our contrast. So re-inking certain areas just kind of helps rebalance it. So we have completed another illustration together, from the very start of the blank page to the very finished of the gouached and inked and watercolored illustration. I had a lot of fun with this one. I had a lot of fun sharing it with you guys. I hope you guys found it helpful, useful, informative. If I lost you along the way, I have some watercolor tutorials that are a little bit more step-by-step, that cover the basics a little bit better, and I will link those down in the description for you guys, and I really hope you will check them out. I have more watercolor start to finish tutorials in a handy dandy playlist that I will also link for you guys if you guys ever feel like sketching, inking, and painting along with me. Or you can just take inspiration from what I'm doing and create your own. I would love to see anything that you make that has been inspired by any of my tutorials. It would really mean a lot to me. So please consider tagging me at Nattosoup, Nattosoup, on basically every single social media site. Tutorials like this were made possible thanks to my amazing patrons on Patreon. Thank you guys so much, and don't forget that you guys have access to this line art as a printable if you guys just want to hang out, chill out, and paint with me.